Many film critics will argue that 1939 was the greatest year in the history of cinema. You had such classics like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, The Wizard of Oz,
Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
Stagecoach, and Gone with the Wind.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
But that was a long time ago. Has there really not been another year that could top 1939? How about 1967, which had some of the most groundbreaking films of all time, like Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, In the Heat of the Night, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and The Dirty Dozen? Or how about 1994, with Forrest Gump, Pulp Fiction, The Shawshank Redemption, The Lion King, and Four Weddings and a Funeral? I think both of those years were superior in both quality and quantity to 1939, but my personal pick for best year in cinema history would have to be 1977. That was the year that brought us Annie Hall, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, The Goodbye Girl, Saturday Night Fever, Smokey and the Bandit, and of course, the biggest hit of the year, Star Wars. But there's one film that almost everyone has forgotten about. It's called The Other Side of Midnight. It was supposed to be one of the biggest hits of the year, but it was completely overshadowed by Star Wars. In fact, I've never met a single person in real life who has ever seen this movie. This is the story of Star Wars and The Other Side of Midnight. In 1971, a young and ambitious film director named George Lucas made THX 1138. This was an extended version of a film that he made in college. The movie received decent reviews, but only made a little money at the box office. The average audience just didn't understand it. After the film's release, Lucas soon began working on the story for Star Wars. However, studios were reluctant to finance another one of his science fiction films. Lucas instead made the movie American Graffiti, which became a huge success and restored his credibility as a filmmaker. He finally convinced 20th Century Fox to support Star Wars. Prior to going to this studio, Lucas had contacted just about every producer in Hollywood, and no one trusted him to make the film or thought that it would be successful. At that time, science fiction movies were usually cheap and short. Lucas wanted to create a massive space epic, and he also wanted to cast the film with unknown actors. Of all the actors to appear in Star Wars, Alec Guinness was the only established star and one of the few people who actually believed in the movie. Guinness took a pay cut to appear in the film on the condition that he received 2.25% of the film's back-end gross. While Star Wars was being filmed, another movie was also in production. Back in 1973, writer Sidney Sheldon had published a novel called The Other Side of Midnight, about an American pilot and his relationship with two women before and after World War II. It was a huge success and was a #1 bestseller that year. Sheldon had gotten his start in Hollywood and even won an Oscar for writing the screenplay to the film The Bachelor and the Bobby Soxer back in 1947. He would go on to create several TV shows in the 60s and 70s, including the highly successful I Dream of Jeannie. His book The Other Side of Midnight and his subsequent novels began flying off the shelves. Sheldon was famous for ending each chapter with a cliffhanger. In an interview, he once said, "I try to write my books so the reader can't put them down. I try to construct them so when the reader gets to the end of it, he or she has to read just one more chapter. It's the technique of the old Saturday afternoon serial. Leave the guy hanging on the edge of the cliff at the end of each chapter." Unlike Star Wars, which no one really wanted to make, The Other Side of Midnight was considered a surefire hit. Best-selling books almost always became blockbusters. As production on Star Wars started to go over budget, Fox began to lose even more faith in the project and started heavily promoting The Other Side of Midnight. They believed that Star Wars would probably be a flop, and they hoped to make enough money back from The Other Side of Midnight to cover all their losses. Movie theaters back then were very different from today. They were not as large and could only show a few different movies each day because they had so few screens. Theaters would get very picky about which movies they would show, and they also had deals with different studios. Theater owners did not want to show Star Wars because, like most of Hollywood, they also believed that the film wouldn't earn a lot of money. Star Wars premiered on a Wednesday at only 32 theaters. However, theaters all over the country couldn't wait to get their hands on The Other Side of Midnight. This prompted Fox to make a very controversial deal. They would only allow theaters to show The Other Side of Midnight if they agreed to show Star Wars as well. The Other Side of Midnight was scheduled to premiere on June 8th, which was about 2 weeks after Star Wars, and 2 weeks was all it took for word of mouth to spread. The movie proved to be insanely popular, and the number of theaters showing the film grew from 32 to over 1,000. People were going to see it multiple times. Some theaters never stopped showing the movie until a year later, and it would go on not just to become the biggest box office hit of the year, but also the highest grossing film of all time, a title Star Wars would hold until 1983 when Steven Spielberg's E.T. surpassed it. So what became of The Other Side of Midnight? Well, it did end up making $24 million, which was a modest success, but it was nowhere near what studios thought it would make. Star Wars ended up becoming so successful that almost every film that came out that summer got little to no attention at all. Another film that also suffered the same fate was The Sorcerer, a film directed by William Friedkin, who had directed such classics as The Exorcist and The French Connection. The film featured Roy Scheider, who had starred in Jaws a few years earlier. It was expected to be a critical and commercial hit and was based on a classic French film called The Wages of Fear, but Sorcerer was released the same exact day as Star Wars, and it would only gross $5.9 million against Star Wars' $775 million. The Other Side of Midnight has become very obscure. As far as I know, you can't buy the film digitally, and Blu-ray and DVD copies tend to be very expensive. Critical reception of the film was also not that great. The film stars Marie-France Pisnard as a poor woman named Noelle, who meets and falls in love with an American pilot during World War II. The pilot is named Larry and is played by John Beck. He leaves her, promising to come back, but never does. Noelle vows revenge, and as the years go by, she becomes a successful actress and begins a relationship with one of the richest men in Greece. Using her connections, Noelle tracks down Larry and hires him to become her personal pilot. At first, he doesn't recognize her, but he soon remembers her and the two rekindle their romance. However, in the time that Larry and Noelle have been apart, Larry has gotten married to a woman named Catherine. The two decide to murder her. Catherine was played by Susan Sarandon in one of her earlier film roles. At this time, she was most known for appearing in the cult film Rocky Horror Picture Show. Although the film's plot is great, it's incredibly slow-paced. The movie has a runtime of almost 3 hours. It's the kind of movie that you can have on in the background and not really miss anything. I would say that the people who went to see Star Wars instead probably made the better decision. Charles Jarrett directed the film, and at the time he was mostly known for costume dramas, but he was still a highly regarded filmmaker. He had won a Golden Globe a few years ago for his film Anne of the Thousand Days, which was also nominated for a whopping 10 Oscars. This film was also expected to be Oscar-worthy, but it ultimately ended up not getting nominated for any major awards at all.
From Sidney Sheldon's best-selling novel.
This is not the end. It's a new beginning.
One woman, torn between 3 men. All want to love her. One must kill her. Jane Seymour, Omar Sharif.
Almost 20 years later, Sheldon would release a sequel to The Other Side of Midnight called Memories of Midnight, which was also a bestseller and was adapted into a TV miniseries starring Gary Nelson and Omar Sharif. Have you ever seen The Other Side of Midnight? Have you ever heard of this movie? Please let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.
Now that's a name I've not heard in a long time.
Let's play.